In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women resulted in the groundbreaking Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action,
an agenda for change which set the tone for the next quarter century of feminist movement building across the globe.
In honor of this momentous gathering and the women and girls who made it possible,
Breakthrough is inviting activist leaders to reflect on what happened and where we go from here.
how have the lives of women and girls changed for the better or for worse?
And how do we keep up momentum in the fight for gender equality?
Well, I think to understand the Beijing Platform for Action, we really have to see it as a part of a process that took place really from 1985 and the Nairobi Third World Conference on Women to Beijing, where women's groups were building political power cross-culturally. And what was really so amazing about the Beijing platform is that it was the result of women's movements that had worked together and begun to network around issues north and south, even east and west in the beginning, although less so, and really had begun also to lobby governments effectively. And this took place before Beijing in other world conferences and at the UN, but Beijing was the culmination of that process in the 1990s, where women were able to lobby for and achieve a platform for action that governments endorsed, that is the most progressive platform governments have ever endorsed around women's rights in the world today. And it was really a result of women's feminist power working in women's movements and learning how to effectively lobby with governments. And also a moment in time when we had more progressive governments than we do today. And we had more women who were progressive feminists in those governments, not necessarily more women in government, but more feminists who managed to be there. So I think that we see the Beijing platform as really a model of what we can do when we learn how to work across lines with governments, but also by working in the women's movement with each other and finding ways to at least find areas of agreement, even where we have disagreements. So in that sense, it still stands as a model of what we want, an imperfect model, of course, after 25 years. There are many new things and many ways in which it could be improved, but it is, for me, a high point in the growth of the feminist movement globally. Well, I think one of the biggest gains for the Platform for Action is the extensive referencing to violence against women. And I particularly named that because this is an issue that came from the women's movement. It wasn't in any UN documents until women pushed for it, really, again, through the series of world conferences on women, but in particular in Nairobi with a full chapter on violence against women, and also a chapter on violence against women in armed conflict. And really, I think the most extensive development up until that point of what it meant to see violence as a fundamental violation of human rights, which had been the demand that we were making throughout the 1990s. I also think that we made gains in the area of sexual and reproductive rights. I call that both a gain and a miss, because we got, in the area of reproductive rights, it's really quite progressive. And in the area of sexual rights, we gained a mention. There's like one paragraph which all of those people working on sexual rights point to whenever we need to say this is in the Beijing platform. But it's just that little paragraph, and it's a miss in terms of all the development that we have to think about today for global processes going forward, of a very extensive understanding of sexual rights to encompass much more than just sexual orientation, which is of course important and important to me, but also the ways in which the control of women's sexuality affects all women's rights, and to really see sexuality and the right to determine your gender, your sex, your expression of that as fundamental to what women have to achieve, because of course, in a male-dominated world, women are the embodiment of sexuality because we are the other to the males for sex. So I think I call it a gain and a miss. It's the most progressive paragraph we had up until 1995. But it was a miss because this movement has grown so enormously since then. And we are still fighting a backlash against the references to that issue. I think the other most important miss is climate change and climate justice. There is again a chapter on the environment, but I think in 1995 we had an opportunity that we missed to show in a more central way the ways in which climate change would affect women's lives. And therefore, I mean, even not just women's lives, but we're saying what women see about the whole environment. It's suggested there, but there's so much more that needs to be developed about how women would view climate in terms of race and class and the intersection of gender with who suffers the most. I think it's very clear today. We have a litany in the platform with the mention of race, class, gender, culture, et cetera, other factors, which is progress. We at least got them to say the words that we think of today as the intersection of gender with all these other factors. But climate justice is such a clear example of how that is happening and how the poor women of the world are the ones who suffer the most from climate change. And yet we can't seem to get governments to take the actions necessary. So that's a miss. And had we been able to do it then, right after the Rio summit in 1992, I think we might have been able to get a little higher up on the priority sooner, this important issue. Well, I think that the current gender equality forum process, or GEF process, as we call it, has built on the platform very well and has picked areas that are very important and in some cases are quite controversial with the backlash, like reproductive rights and sexual rights, and violence against women has even become controversial. Not all violence, but violence that is so directly linked to male power in the family and male individual control of women. I think it's done a good job of bringing together some action points in the coalitions. The real question that it faces is really the same question we've had since 1995 with the Beijing platform, which is how do we get these things implemented? And the gender equality forum process was aimed at identifying key areas and getting those commitments from governments and bringing in more directly the private sector. But there's still a kind of contradiction built into that, where many of the people we're asking to solve the problem are addressing the problem in the broad society, but not necessarily how their own interests and businesses, government or private business, are actually perpetuating the problem. And so you get companies addressing one aspect of the problem, whereas the real problem is what they're doing in another area. So, you know, Coca-Cola is willing to put money into UN Women, but it's still creating problems around water in many parts of the world. And those are serious issues. If we could get them to address what they're doing that's a water problem, for example, and I'm not singling them out, but just as an example, rather than putting money in something else. This is, I think, where we really have to be able to move. And the same with governments. They will choose to address a problem and commit to something that is not necessarily the worst thing they're doing. And it's great to get them to commit to anything. I'm not opposed to that, but we really have to be able to talk about, what are the sources of these problems, and where are they the perpetrators, if not directly of the action, through inaction, in the case of governments in particular, where it is their unwillingness to take action on things that we really need to address. So I think that the GEF process has done probably as much as you could do politically in this environment. But the challenge is, how do we keep building the movement that can pressure for accountability to those promises and those commitments? And I started there with Beijing because I think we would never have had the Beijing Platform for Action if the women's movement hadn't been very strong in the 90s and really been able to be a constituency that could put pressure on governments in particular. And now, 25 years later, again, we have the same challenge. We have promises. Better to have the words than nothing. But as Bella Abzug used to say, we have the words, now we need the music. Whatever it is to implement these words and these commitments, it's still the challenge. And I think the environment of conservatism and backlash, I say backlash in particular because we made progress. Backlash is because women's rights has made progress. And so I don't want to discourage people. We wouldn't have backlash if we hadn't made progress, if we hadn't been really challenging patriarchal control and the systems of racism and capitalism that go with it. We have really challenged these systems. But now we are having to find more effective ways to defend those things that we have moved forward, and also to bring more people into the benefits. Because for me, the saddest part of the backlash is how many women participate in backlash against feminism. And I think that's because we've made progress and many, many women's lives are better because of it. But there are still women who've been left behind. And those women are the ones who are vulnerable to the backlash and conservative forces because they are still dependent on communities and particularly individual men, because the circumstances of their lives have not changed enough. So it's our challenge now to bring along sort of the rest of the world, women and men, who haven't yet benefited from gender equality.